And if Prost comes up to any of them, this is the opportunity that Senna's looking for, and he's going through. Ouch! Oh my goodness, this is fantastic. They meet. This is what we were fearing might happen during the race. And that means to say that Prost has won the World Championship. Alain Prost, World Champion of 1989.
He wasn't past Prost, and he went into a gap, and Prost had every right.
What's a more fitting way to welcome the 2019 Japanese Grand Prix at the Suzuka circuit in Japan than to talk about one of the most famous moments in Formula One history, exactly 30 years ago at the Japanese Grand Prix. But this time, we're going to go way back because it was between Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna. Now, this Grand Prix in particular was rich in not only history, but very rich in controversy. And we're going to talk about all the reasons why. So the objective of today is to really understand what happened at the 1989 Grand Prix. Should it have been the basis for what decided ultimately the 1989 Drivers' World Championship? And going forward, how do we really view this race? Was it fair to Ayrton Senna? Was it fair to Alain Prost? Was everything done according to the book? We'll answer all that and then some, starting right now. In doing the research for this mini story, I found after dozens of hours of research, footage, analysis, and conversations, it makes the most sense to really start with the key points and actually present a case that may be contrarian to the major assumptions that a lot of people hold. After having all these conversations, I've noticed there's a couple key points that just ring true throughout most people's ideas and recollection of what happened. Now, of those three things, we're going to talk about the major assumptions or just the skewed data that most people use who feel what happened in 1989 was the right move to make. But there's a reason why I'm calling these misconceptions. Now, I'll say right now, it doesn't prove the null, but it should make you look again at the information and reassess to see if you come to the same conclusion. So the point of this video really is to make you double click on what you think you know about the 1989 Grand Prix and introduce new information I may have missed. But let's delve into it together. Misconception 1. Senna was DQ'd for using the escape road. Misconception 2. Well, Senna got the restart. That's illegal. Misconception 3. It was Senna's fault. Let's start with the escape road. It's commonly stated that Senna used the escape road, which was clearly against the rules. This is technically wrong. It's perfectly legal to use the escape road. Let's start with the actual stated reason. So, Senna was DQ'd because he rejoined the track illegally. That simple. In the 10 years prior to the Japanese Grand Prix in 1989 at Suzuka, exactly 26 drivers had been disqualified for various reasons. 0 of them for cutting a chicane, 0 of them for taking a track, path, or circuit route that just wasn't allowed. The 56th article of the 1989 Formula One Disciplinary Code states, if a car got stuck on track in a dangerous situation in which they would be in contact with a car, whether in control or out of control, basically if they were within striking distance, the marshals could move that car to a safer place. That technically wouldn't qualify as outside influence, because outside influence, as we know, is disqualification, especially when you look at the cars of that era. The driver can race again if he can get the car working properly without that outside assistance. But this would exclude the removal from the unsafe place. If they do move, the marshals do move the vehicle, they do move the car, and the driver gets the car going based on that assistance, totally legal. The caveat to this rule is the driver must return to the scene which the incident occurred. One of the best ways I use to actually present an analogous situation, especially in sporting, is to kind of liken it to golf. There's a rule in golf in that if you hit your ball out of bounds, you can place your ball as close as possible to that entry point without putting your ball closer to the actual flagstick itself. Now, there's caveats to that rule as well, and that is barring extenuating circumstances like hazard or safety. Let's talk about the major caveats that are debated even within, let's call them sub-caveats, even within this case itself that may cut against Senna's Suzuka disqualification. So I'm going to call this one A. Because he didn't return to the corner, the contact was made technically. He cut the corner, he cut the chicane, and that is why he was disqualified. Well, the incident happened before the corner was ever started. Therefore, it wasn't ever taken. This is where, despite being very literal, I can't really accept this. There's a lot of people who defend this and say Senna should be DQ'd based on this logic. This purposely ignores simple logic. It's obvious if you are cutting a chicane, you are gaining an advantage. That is the purpose. This is very similar to the issue I had with Leclerc and Monza, where he cut the chicane, and despite not having a quote-unquote time advantage, he never was truly punished for his own error, in which he kept his track position over Lewis Hamilton. Senna was severely punished for the contact, and in no way, shape, or form benefited from cutting that chicane. It also is the reason Leclerc wasn't penalized, ironically, in Monza. Again, he kept his track position, and that's where I think these rulings diverge. Let's move over to B. Additionally, Senna was not able to make a sharp right once his car was restarted. If you look at where he restarted, there was no way he was ever going to make that. And C, Senna was unable to return to the chicane he supposedly cut due to it being very, very unsafe. This was reported to have been discussed to no end and no solution and resolution coming by the end of the drivers' meeting, and it wasn't formalized, but the only way you could do that is if you went in reverse. And that's actually just more dangerous, especially risking a head-on collision. This was actually the topic of the 1990 Suzuka Grand Prix, the Japanese Grand Prix driver meeting, in which Senna actually walked right out of in the middle of.
Gentlemen, morning. The numbers of laps from green light to checkered flag will be 53 laps. Dangerous behavior and/or dangerous maneuver will be investigated immediately and may lead to suspension of the license for one or more Formula 1 World Championships events. Any questions?
Yes. It was a big up last year with Ayrton. Why we have to repeat the same thing? The same thing is, if you miss the chicane, the steward stop you. All right. I have no traffic, let you go. If you have to turn around and go backwards against another car, that's much dangerous.
Okay.
Does everybody feel that way?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Huh? I can't stand this. It's a joke. What happened last year, it's a joke, this situation. You just prove here, I said nothing, and you see somebody raising the point, and you see everybody agree. And last year was really bad for me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened to me.
It had come up, this exact topic, if you cut the chicane at a corner in which you cannot return to unless you go in reverse. It was brought up that this is actually really unsafe because, like we said, you risk head-on collision. And just very cavalierly and casually, it was decided right then and there that, yes, you won't be penalized. And this was the exact point in Senna's defense that he was making in 1989, in which he was actually overruled and on top of that further penalized on an appeal. Now that we've talked about those sub-bullet points within that one little caveat, let's move on to the next topic, because ultimately, Senna was not DQ'd for rejoining the track via the runoff, like we said. It was in conjunction with another microscopic nuance, which still may not hold actual water when we actually talk about it. So let's get into the details. So next, we're going to talk about outside help on a restart. This is a very favorite topic of conversation for those who defend the outcome of the 1989 Suzuka Grand Prix. And when you talk through the first thing I just talked about, which is you can't return to the scene. You can't really cut the chicane either because you're not gaining an advantage, but you can't actually go in reverse. Okay, then the next topic of argument is, well, he had outside help. He was restarted and that's illegal. Not true. He actually can get outside help. It's not illegal to be restarted if you are an unsafe part of the track. The real loophole that made it stick for the FIA, especially in his appeal, as well as a lot of those who believe Senna should have been DQ'd, was that he had 2 attempts to get his car restarted. This is the one part where I will openly concede you'd have a case. But if Senna failed to restart the McLaren, then he should be DQ'd according to the rules. Failing the first time and then the caveat would be he was moved to a new part of the track which was deemed to be safe. Now, again, that little pause, that micro pause might be small, but if it was deemed to be safe, that would be technically a new attempt, because if they didn't try to move him or restart him in any way, shape, or form, his car would be left in a position where it wouldn't be a danger to the other part of the track. The argument in defense of Senna would be, well, It's an extension of his car being removed. If the removal was only half done, he should be able to get his car a fair attempt at a start. So in that situation, he would be entitled to exploit, for lack of better words, the nuance in the rule. They never fully removed his car and gave him a fair shot at a restart, which is evident by the second they push again after that little micro pause, if that's what you want to call it. His car starts up and gets going again, fine. I can't say that the initial attempt was an attempt at all, and frankly, this would be the best shot at convincing me. For such circumstantial evidence in which it's a judgment call, really, it's surprising how strongly people will cling to this notion. Let's get to the third point. It was Senna's fault. I left this one for last, and you may be wondering, why would you do that? Isn't it the most juicy part? Actually, no, not really for me, but let me explain that. Ironically, this was the least contentious for me. I had an opinion going into this, but not growing up in this era and following the drivers, not really being a mega fan yet, this was not something that I had really delved too much into. And after taking a closer look, it would be really difficult to try to convince me that Prost didn't know exactly what he was doing. When it comes to actual data, I'm not in his head. I don't have anything on radio. Maybe it's 99%. Obviously, if I'm looking at this, I have my own opinion, but at the end of the day, I really can't say with full certainty that he did this on purpose. So, if you're going to accuse someone of something like that, we need something written or recorded. Now, the closest thing we have to that, ironically, is when he says, before the race, he says to his engineers, he says to Senna himself, I'm not going to leave the door open. They both understand how important this race is to the championship. Prost warned everyone. Now, that doesn't make it okay. Hear me loud and clear. That does not make it okay. But it is important to know, because Senna should be driving with that in mind. Now, you could make the argument that shouldn't change his driving. That's unfair. That's illegal. He should get... That's fine. All that is fine. And we'll get into why all that does go into the calculation as to why you should be thinking about this. But if you're Senna, you couldn't have really exposed yourself worse. You almost knew for a fact that he was really going to do that. Letting Senna by and onto that first position would essentially mean he's taking that momentum into the next two races. Now, keep in mind, Senna smashed Alain Prost in the qualifying. So if he destroyed him in the Japanese Grand Prix qualifying, he's got 2 races left, and you think about the old scoring system, he's got 2 races left. He essentially has to win those 2 races. I don't know if you've seen the 1989 actual standings and how the race results played out, but even when you look at qualifying, him qualifying first, there's a good chance that Ayrton Senna, under the gun, needing to win, is probably going to deliver. And he out-qualified Alain Prost quite a bit. He was on pole for a heavy majority of that entire season. I get it, though. I get it. The laps were dwindling. The window of opportunity was closing and disappearing. Prost had the straight line advantage aerodynamically without DRS, and DRS was just still long before its inception. So Senna had to make a move. I'm not criticizing his decision to make the move. But because I feel like it was a totally acceptable risk for him and the fate he was clearly ready to battle back from, I don't really make a fuss over this part of the story. If we were lucky enough to ask Senna today, does he fault Prost for the move? I would be willing to bet my last dollar that later in life he'd firmly admit that there was nothing wrong with what he had done. He wouldn't really have a problem with Alain Prost's move. I think any driver would have done that. But let's go over the overtaking rules just to calm you down. What is not allowed in the overtaking sequences? So, point 1, if you cause an avoidable collision. Point 2, if you force a driver off the track. Point 3, if you illegitimately prevent a legitimate overtaking maneuver by a driver. Point 4, if you illegitimately impede another driver during their overtaking. We're going to look at the footage and we've seen, we'll show some of the pictures, but it's pretty clear all those things were done. Let's go through some more of these common fallacies when you look at Prost's point of view and try to defend what he did. Point 1, it was Prost's corner. It just wasn't. Right? It just wasn't. The door was wide open, almost to the point where it looks like he might have left it open to bait him. If you're taking a defensive line, you hug that corner. Prost was even slowing his pace to wear Senna's tires and kill his engine by following close in the dirty air, knowing he had the straight line advantage. So point 2, it's an impossible move for Senna to even begin with. Ambitious, yeah, but impossible, no. In fact, he successfully completes this exact same overtake in the exact same location on similar circumstances. Point 3, Prost held his natural racing line and Senna dove into him. There's just no way. You look at the footage and think Prost's line is normal or natural in any sense of the word. If you do the projections and just look at where this would have carried him, he'd have all 4 tires in the grass if he continued at this angle. This was not a racing line he held throughout the race. This was not a racing line he took during qualifying. Frankly, this was not a racing line any of the drivers took because it'd be race ruining. What really convinced me to dilute this part in the analysis was Senna's performance after. There's a common saying in just about all sports, the ball don't lie. How events play out for you after are indicative of your metaphorical sports karma. That is, if you're treated unfairly, you still somehow manage to receive the outcome that was unjustly taken from you. Despite a lengthy restart, where Senna's sitting there for quite a while trying to get his car going again, you're dragging your front end all the way around for another lap to the pit, a 17-second pit stop, and then after a 6-second gap to the leader, still catches him, overtakes him at the exact spot in which all this occurred and still manages to win, and still gets the win taken from him. So if you are saying it's Senna's fault, what the thing you can be most confident is Senna was prepared, regardless of what happens, to finish that race, and not only finish, to win that race. If his car was moving, he was winning. And that should show you at least that he was there to win. He wasn't there to play politics, he was there to win. But no matter how you slice it, it's kind of irrelevant to me because Prost didn't even finish the race regardless. His car was basically fine and perfectly subject within the rules to a Marshall restart. But he only gave some comments about this over the years about why he never finished. None of which really satisfied those who were convinced this wasn't purposeful. The very interesting thing I noticed was when he was asked about this, he never claimed he didn't get a restart because it was against the rules. That always led me to believe he quietly never believed getting a restart was against the rules to begin with for Senna. And if that wasn't against the rules, and he couldn't go backwards head on into traffic, any reasonable person would say that, well then he'd have to admit Senna did nothing wrong. So looking at all this information, looking at the fact that it's pretty clear Alain Prost had an agenda, judging by the fact that he jumped immediately out of his car, he had no real damage, he had no business really not finishing that race. He had a plan, that's clear. Now we can't assume his motives, but he did have a plan. Senna did make his position clear. It's also pretty clear that Alain Prost turned in way too early. He was braking very early and turned in way too early. It's also clear, based on just where the cars were when they touched, Senna, regardless if it would have been a perfect corner, it might have been a lockup, it might have been a lot of things, but he could have made that corner based on his speed. And on top of all that, he proved it again in the coming laps when he overtook for the lead, that a similar move could be pulled off. Now, he did push Nannini, he did bully him on the track, but that was still a legal move. It was just a strong move by Ayrton Senna, someone who wanted to win. But at the end of the day, I think Senna knew that that's exactly what could have happened. And against all of that, he still ended up winning the race. So the only issue I have, and I'm left with, is it was a hammer looking for a nail, and Ayrton Senna was the perfect nail in this situation, and it was unfair. And I'm not purposefully being down the middle, but the point of it is to be fair and objective. Because the fact remains that you could make a very solid argument that Senna tried to restart his car a second time once his car was removed to a safe place. Technically, under the rules, that could have been the reason he was disqualified. Now, that wasn't the stated reason he was disqualified, and that would have been a convenient excuse to go back after the fact. But according to the rules, you could make the case that he did take a second attempt. Now, I would land that that's still an extenuation of the first attempt, as he only had 2 marshals pushing the car, and then he finally got all the marshals to properly move him. But you could make the case that that was a second attempt, in which case he'd be getting outside help when his car was already in a safe place. Did Ayrton Senna make an aggressive move that exposed him to someone that may haven't had an agenda? Yeah, he shouldn't have put himself and allowed himself to be subject to something like that. Do I think that Ayrton Senna made a mistake in terms of his driving, and did he himself break the rules on his late break? No. Did I think Alain Prost turned into him? Did I think he made an unsafe situation very clear? Yeah, I do. But can I understand it? I can. I can understand it. And I think Ayrton Senna would too. But all that aside, you have to decide for yourself. Was this an unfair disqualification? Because like we said, we clearly see Ayrton Senna was ready to drive, and they took that away from him. So do you think this was an unfair qualification? Do you think that Alain Prost should have been penalized for what he did on the track itself? Let me know in the comments below, because this really is open for a conversation, especially with the off-season coming up. I'm going to make a ton more content like this. I'm going to start a series called F1 Wars, and this will probably be up there with one of the early episodes in early series seasons. So let me know what you think, and we'll see you soon, and looking forward to a Japanese Grand Prix that's hopefully as drama-filled as this one. See you soon, guys.